Hello and welcome to this episode of Trader Talk TV. Today, I am delighted to be joined by David Reischer, who is product manager at Permutive. And today we are talking about identity and privacy, talking about them in combination, because often we find that identity is talked about in pure isolation, and actually they are very, very much need to be spoken about in great togetherness. So David's going to explain to us exactly why identity and privacy needs to be spoken about in conjunction. So David, welcome.
Hello, hi, thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So we're talking about identity in a post-cookie world. And as I've just said, that can't be done in isolation. We always have to talk about privacy alongside it. Why is that? And why aren't we talking about identity and privacy as one? But why should we be?
Yeah, so as you say, over the last year or two, there was a lot of discussion around identity. But I really believe it's really important to actually keep in mind why we have those discussions. And really the driving force behind us talking about identity is coming from regulators and browser vendors and all of the changes that they're pushing forward. And really they have like one clear objective, which is around protecting user privacy. So when we actually start discussing identity as an industry, we really can't do that in isolation. We always need to discuss identity and privacy as one topic. Ultimately, as an industry, we're not going to win an arms race against regulators and browser vendors. So when we speak about identity and when we're designing new solutions, these solutions really have to be sustainable and they have to adhere to those privacy standards that are being laid out.
And just to clarify for those that maybe aren't sure and are using these words probably interchangeably, what do we mean by identity and what do we mean by privacy?
Yes. So when we speak of identifiers, typically what we mean is cross-domain identifiers. So a solution that allows to recognize a single user across many different domains or different environments. So a solution that allows to say that I'm the same user on domain A and domain B and domain C. And these identifiers, these cross-domain identifiers, they really power a few of the core functionality of ad tech and programmatic advertising specifically. Things like measurement and attribution, frequency capping, data targeting, more specifically within that audience targeting for branding campaigns, retargeting, modeling and prospecting. All of those things rely on the capability to tell that a user is the same user regardless of which domain the user is on.
Interesting. And so how does that compare to what we would define as privacy?
So privacy, when we speak about privacy, really the questions that we need to ask is who is a controller of data, who has a relationship with that user, and how is data being shared within the ecosystem. And there's really two layers to it. One is the actual identifier that is being used and the privacy implication of that identifier and the user controls that that identifier offers. And the second layer is more of like an application logic. How are those identifiers then used to connect the ecosystem, and how is data being shared across different environments using that identifier? So really, I think like a good first step is to kind of look at the identifiers themselves first and assess them from a privacy perspective, and then actually look at use cases to understand how those identifiers are being used today and how they might be used in the future, and what the implications there are when it comes to data sharing and therefore the exposure of user data.
That makes perfect sense. So explain to me what the common cross-domain identifiers are. How are they defined?
Yeah, of course. So for a long time, and arguably still today, the predominant cross-domain identifier is the third-party cookie. But now with the changes that have already happened on Safari and Firefox and Google Chrome's announcement, we've started looking at other ID types as well. And I'd say lately we've heard a lot about different ID solutions, but generally you can bucket all of those ID solutions into one of three categories. And I think it's pretty important to remember that any ID solution that we talk about really boils down to one of those three. There isn't really like any magic. What's technically possible is really clearly determined by the browsers and what they technically allow us to do. So if we start looking at 3 different categories, firstly, we obviously have cookies. And when we speak about cookies, I think most people are fairly familiar with cookies. There's not too much need to go into much detail here, but quite generally, on a high level, cookies are a small text file that a web server can store in a user's browser against a specific domain. So that means apptech.com can store a random ID in your browser and then re-identify you whenever a request is made to apptech.com. I think that the most important thing here is to differentiate between first and third-party cookies, and that's all about the context. A first-party cookie is all within the scope of the domain that you're currently visiting, whereas a third-party cookie is when you're on domain A and there's a request going out to domain B and the cookie is attached to that request. That is a third-party cookie. It's in a different context.
Yes, that's very important. And in this context, we're referring more to the third-party cookie rather than, of course, the first-party cookie.
Exactly. Yeah, so when I say cookie, I generally mean third-party cookies.
Yeah.
Are going to go away. First-party cookies aren't.
Right. Excellent.
The second identifier category is deterministic. So those are identifiers that really take some hard ID at their core. That's typically a hashed email address. Sometimes that's encrypted through some proprietary protocol. It really comes down to a hashed email address being the identifier. What's important to know about those kind of identifiers is that they really only work where a user is logged in. So if you want to reach a specific users on domains A, B, and C, that user has to be logged in on every single domain, so you can recognize it's the same user.
Right, that makes sense.
And then the third category is probabilistic / fingerprinting. So what's happening here is that we're taking a bunch of signals that on their own don't actually mean too much. So things like your IP address or your user agent, maybe your screen resolution, and they're combined into unique fingerprints. So by actually combining them together, they become something that really identifies an individual user with usually a pretty high probability. And the W3C is defining 2 types of fingerprints. So there's active fingerprinting. Active fingerprinting generally requires code on the page to read things like your screen resolution, your installed fonts, some specifics of your machine. And then there's passive fingerprinting. And what's happening there is that solutions might read signals that are by default included in every HTTP request, things like an IP address or a user agent. So there's no entity actively asking for it. It's just exposed by default.
Okay, that's interesting. Great. So what then? So each of these are 3 common identifiers when it comes to identity and privacy. What then are the privacy, specifically the privacy implications of each of these?
Yes. So if we look at those categories, I think it's really important to assess the privacy risk that comes with each of them. And I would argue that they're really sitting on a scale. So if we start with cookies, obviously the usage of cookies hasn't been great so far, and they've drawn a lot of attention onto them. But from a user controls perspective, they're probably still the best out of the 3. So as an end user, you still have the possibility to reset your cookies. You can delete all of those cookies that are stored on your machine. And that means even if then a third party recreates a new cookie for you, that is a new random identifier that cannot actually be reconnected to any data previously collected so easily. So purely from a user controls perspective, there's probably most control with cookies. If we then move on to deterministic identifiers, they still offer some controls for the user. So as a user, you can decide to log out from a website and then delete your cookies, which means you can no longer be identified. Obviously, this requires an extra step. It requires extra knowledge. However, what I think from a privacy perspective is actually more challenging with deterministic identifiers is that as soon as you log in, this new ID that's going to be created for you is still based on your email address. And your email address is very unlikely to change over time. So all of that data that has been collected for you historically can then easily be reattributed to your new identity. So while you can, opt out at a given point, there's not really an easy way to reset your identity to, have a fresh start when it comes to data. And then lastly, when we talk about probabilistic and fingerprinting, I think it's pretty clear that this is the worst when it comes to end user privacy. Unlike the other approaches, there's really no control at all for the end user. I, as an end user, I cannot easily just change my IP address or my user agent or my screen resolution. There's no way for me to just reset my ID. And I think it even goes as far as if you think about, browsing in an incognito tab, you still have the same IP address. You still have the same screen resolution. You still have the same user agent. So really, from a privacy perspective, probabilistic and fingerprinting is really, really bad because there's zero controls for the user.
That's interesting. So what I'm getting from this is that obviously with each of these identifiers, what the end goal, the purpose is to allow the individual, the consumer, to be able to be in control of their own identity and their own user privacy, to allow them to be able to delete and refresh and renew and choose what information any publisher, any advertiser can see about that individual. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would argue that user controls are always a positive thing. I think what's also clear is, and what we need to be aware of is that probably the average user is not going to be aware of all of the details. So I think the first step is to just assess different identifiers from a user control perspective. And then on top of that, we also need to talk about applications as well. Just because there are user controls doesn't mean those identifiers should just be used in any way possible.
So what fascinates me is, there's a lot of talk in the industry about the future of the third-party cookie. We know what the future of third-party cookie is, that basically from an ad tech perspective, it has no future. What fascinates me is what you think the world will look like next year and beyond. There's obviously a lot going on. There's companies like Permutive that are taking great strides in creating the future of what identity actually looks like. And in this context, obviously, identity and privacy. Where is it going?
Yes. So I think really the first step when looking into the future is what we've just done now is lay out what is actually the motivation, the driving force behind those changes. We need to be really cognizant of why do we need to redesign ad tech, and also to keep in mind what are the technical opportunities, possibilities out there, what routes can we go down, and what routes should we avoid. So I think if we need to take learnings, privacy learnings, when redesigning ad tech for the open web for when the third-party cookie goes away, there's really three things to it. I think the first one is, I would argue that fingerprinting and probabilistic models just aren't a good idea. So I think that's really the first piece. Browser vendors have made it really, really clear that they're going to do whatever necessary to stop this from happening. Google Chrome has already announced a few things. They're going to reduce the amount of information that's included in the user agent string. So that's what they call UA hints. So there's going to be way less information there, way less surface area that can be used to create a fingerprint. Chrome has also announced the privacy budget, which is technology that keeps track of how many properties are being requested. So if there's a script on page that requests the screen resolution and the font and so on, the browser is going to keep track of that, and the browser is going to warn the end user if so many properties are being retrieved that they can be used to form a unique fingerprint. So it's really, really clear that browsers are very determined to stop that from happening. Another example here is Safari's WebKit, who have already limited access to several web APIs. And they've also really clearly stated that they'll treat any tracking circumvention, any circumvention of the ITP protocol with exactly the same seriousness as any exploitation of security vulnerabilities. So I think going down that route is just a really, really bad idea. It's bad for the end user's privacy, and it's not sustainable. Browsers are just going to stop it.
Interesting. So we have to appreciate the control the browsers have in this broader conversation about identity, and the steps they're taking to try to make sure that the consumer does come first.
Yes, 100%.
Right.
The second thing is to, once we've actually looked at those identifiers and we know what identifiers are going to be available in the future of the open web, to actually understand that the open web really is going to be split into two categories. So if we look at the open web today, and if we say that this y-axis is 100% of users, 100% of traffic, really in today's world, we still have the cookie, and that accounts for something like 55% or so of the traffic. Then we have users that are authenticated. That's pretty small today. It's less than 5% typically. And then we have all of the anonymous users today. So users that are on Safari and Firefox, which is around 40%. And those are users that are already invisible to the buy side. So as a buyer, you cannot see and recognize those user IDs. They're completely invisible.
Why are they invisible?
Because they just don't have that cross-domain identifier. They don't have a third-party cookie, and they don't have a deterministic identifier. So there's just no cross-domain identifier available, which means if you're a buyer and you see an impression for that user, there is no cross-domain identifier that you can use to attribute any data to that impression.
Right, thank you.
And we also know that this is going to look quite different in 14 months' time, roughly. So really, this is going away. So there's not going to be any third-party cookies left. Deterministic identifiers are quite likely to go up a bit. So we might end up with something like 10% or so as publishers get more users to register and to log in. But I think the main thing that we need to recognize is that this bucket of anonymous users is really going to become the default state on the web. So 90%, 95% of users are going to fall into this anonymous bucket. And that means we're really going to end up with two categories of users on the open web: authenticated users and anonymous users. What I've laid out here, I think it's just important to mention, is really through the lens of an advertiser. If we look at this through the lens of a publisher, it's quite different. Obviously, because a publisher has a first-party relationship with the end user, they're always able to recognize 100% of their users. So they can actually see every single user within their environment. And really what this leads to in this cookieless privacy-first feature is that publishers are increasingly going to look like walled gardens. So that means that within each individual publisher environment, data is going to continue to work. Publishers are going to continue to see all of their users. They're going to understand their behaviors and interests. But the connective tissue across all of these publisher environments, the cross-domain identifier, is going to go away for the vast majority of the open web. And my takeaway for this is, yes, it's we should look at solutions for this part here, for the authenticated web. But I think it's also pretty important to actually start thinking about the 95% of users and how data-driven advertising is going to look like for them. And I believe to make data work here, it just requires closer collaboration between the buy and the sell side to actually leverage this potential here in a privacy-safe way. So working more closely together to make data work, while at the same time protecting the end user's privacy.
That's fascinating, David. And so this 90%, this 40% that you estimate, could end up being 90% once obviously the third-party cookie is completely denigrated. That is what a publisher would currently refer to as passerby traffic, right? So it's traffic that comes to their site that will no longer be identifiable because that user is not logged in. Is that correct?
So I would say it can be passerby traffic. So it could be users that land on the publisher side, have one session, browse, and then go away, and the publisher isn't going to see them for quite a while. But it could also be really, really engaged users that just don't register and sign up with that publisher. So really, any user that doesn't have an account with that publisher is going to fall into this 90% bucket.
And so the common goal for publishers and advertisers to, as you say, to collaborate more? And is the common goal for them to try to get a higher level of deterministic data? Is that what everyone should be pushing for? Or should they be pushing for, actually, there's a massive amount of benefit to going after the contextual environment and this identifiable, identifiable open web, the other half, which is obviously the majority, not the half, is actually that, should that be where a lot more publishers and buyers are actually focusing on and trying to understand how they can make the most out of those users and not just the ones that they're logging in?
Yeah, so I would say that arguably the authenticated part is going to play an important role. So even though it's going to be a very small percentage, I think there's no doubt that this is going to be really important for various different use cases.
It's quality as well, right? It's a quality audience. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we just need to be aware of the scale. Realistically, it's just not going to give us enough scale on its own. We need to look at it more holistically, and we just need to be aware of the fact that the vast majority of the open web isn't going to be authenticated.
Interesting. And do you think that there is opportunity here in the unauthenticated web for publishers and buyers alike? Is there an opportunity for them to take advantage of it and stop worrying about the denigration of the third-party cookie and focus instead on what this new opportunity holds for them, which arguably seems to be absolutely vast?
Yes, 100%. So I think just, with a few of like those core principles, there's still a lot of, clever targeting and decisions that you can do. You just need to like rethink it a little bit. You need to be aware of who owns the relationship, who is the data controller, and who applies the targeting. So in a world today that is somewhat very centralized, because you have this common identifier that spans across all of those different environments, we're just going to end up in a world that's going to look way more decentralized with individual publisher environments. But that doesn't mean you cannot leverage that rich understanding that publishers have of their first-party data. It's just going to require new ways to integrate and to work with that, and maybe some of the targeting rules that's set on the buy side today have to like shift somewhere else so they can actually be applied across the 90 and 95% of users. But I think, another thing that we really need to think about is as we design those solutions, how we really can design them with privacy in mind and apply those like privacy by design principles. And that's really for me the third key takeaway, is that when we start building new solutions, we really need to adapt this privacy by design principles. We need to look at—
What do we mean by privacy by design?
What I mean with that is really that we need to look at very specific use cases, and we need to start thinking about how we can actually limit the data exposure as much as possible. So go away from a world where more data, even without a concrete use case, is better, to actually understand how we can still allow valuable use cases to work, but at the same time limit the data as much as possible to ultimately protect the end user's privacy as much as possible. And I think, one great example of that is actually when we look at OpenRTB. Obviously, OpenRTB is something that gained a lot of attention from regulators because of the amount of data that's being exposed. So if we can, let's take like a concrete example here. Let me just get up something here. If we look at how data is actually being sent into the bid stream today, what's happening is if a user lands on a publisher's website, there's a request that goes out to an SSP, and that includes a user ID, and it also includes quite a bit of contextual information as well. And that information is then being forwarded to the various buying platforms, where buyers can make a decision based on the user ID and other data that's included there. But what's also happened is that because you actually have a user ID together with all of that contextual information, it's actually been possible to aggregate that data and start building out vast user profiles that include your user ID, but also exactly what sites you've visited, what content you have consumed, when and where you did that. But if we now look at a world where we really care about the user ID for one-to-one targeting, so let's say I'm an advertiser and I want to reach a very specific user, I think we should ask the question, can we reduce the amount of information that's being exposed to allow that targeting of a very specific user in the programmatic world, while also make sure we protect user privacy? And I would say if we imagine that this contextual bit goes away, and we only leave the user ID in here, you can still reach the user you want to reach. But this bit over here, the aggregation of all your content consumption for a specific user becomes impossible. And I think that becomes ever so more important when the user ID becomes a deterministic identifier, a hashed email address, to make sure there aren't any companies that can aggregate all of your browsing against your hashed email address. So it's really just about looking at specific use cases and understanding how can we reduce the amount of data to what's strictly required to make that use case work. On the
quite interesting.
On the flip side, at the same time, I think we can expose contextual information and maybe even audience signals that come from publishers. So there can be a world where publishers make context, maybe their understanding of how a user should be classified, available in the bit stream, sent that out to all of those partners. But importantly, I guess there has to be no user ID. So if there is no user ID that can be connected to these signals up here, again, it becomes impossible to build up an aggregate profile with those data signals. And I think ultimately it's the ecosystems and also the publishers specifically responsibility to control what data gets exposed in the bit stream. And I think specifically for publishers, there's really two clear objectives here. Firstly, it's to protect the end user's privacy, to stop this from happening, and also for their own interests to actually protect their first-party data assets. So if they make data available, make sure it's not being made available in any way that it can be aggregated by a third party. It's only the minimum that's really required for a specific use case.
So obviously, with publishers having a large focus on first-party data and being able and a focus on deterministic data and modeling, with the opportunity with context, do they now have a responsibility to ensure that there is a far greater, I mean, we talked about privacy by design, far greater importance around privacy, understanding around privacy of their users than they did before, or can they largely carry on unchanged?
So I think for a large portion of the web, that's going to happen automatically, because for 95% of the web, there's not going to be a cross-domain identifier. Really, what I drew out at the bottom here is going to become the default state automatically, just because of the fact that there is no user ID. I think what's really important, though, is that as we start working with deterministic identifiers, what I described up here, to really think about what it means and take it as an opportunity to really redesign some of those use cases in a more privacy-friendly way, to really live up to that responsibility for the end user, protecting their privacy, making sure that this massive data aggregation at scale isn't possible anymore. I also think that quite generally, for publishers, there is a great opportunity to power some of those data-driven use cases in a cookieless world, with them really becoming the only source of customer understanding, user understanding across 90%, 95% of the web. There is a lot of opportunity to have closer collaboration, to connect ecosystems together in a privacy-friendly way, meaning everyone maintains control of their data. Data isn't being shared, but still to power that understanding that every single publisher has of their users.
And what role, what responsibility almost does technology play in the wider portion of this? It's not just down to the publisher. It isn't just down to the buyer. Obviously, Permutive are playing a great role in this, by the very nature of what your business is and does. How does what is tech's involvement in this?
I think every single technology vendor just needs to keep in mind of the direction that we're traveling, what browser vendors are aiming for, what their objectives are, what regulators are asking for. There's very little point in building solutions that go against the charter that browser vendors are setting out. It's just not going to be sustainable. In an ideal world, really protecting the end user's privacy would be the driving force. But also, ultimately, if what you're building doesn't protect the end user's privacy, it's going to get shut down, either by regulators or by the browser vendors. So I think everyone just needs to play together and just really be aware of what's on the table and really redesign a world that's really oriented around users' privacy and make sure that we can make data-driven advertising work, but do it in a privacy-safe way.
And that's a beautiful sentiment. Obviously, everyone playing together. You paint this wonderful picture, David. But what you're ultimately saying is we're trying to get to a world where what we as advertisers, as publishers, as the ad tech, as the digital advertising industry does is consumer-led rather than ad tech-led. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. That's absolutely fascinating. I think it's mapped it out really well, and it's really interesting to see kind of the different the numbers we're talking about here when we refer to deterministic data versus what will now be this unauthenticated web, and just how vast that is versus the number of logged in users actually everybody has. And that's what I think makes it interesting. Do you see a world where context actually overtakes and becomes more important than deterministic, largely because would you see a world where context continues to evolve and grow, and the context that there's almost a fear around context and the way people speak about context, they're talking about it the way context was sort of 10 years ago, which was it was functional and it did what it could at the time, but context has moved on a lot, and there's a lot that can be done with context that I wonder if people don't really realize. Do you see the opportunity around context continuing to grow and evolve?
I definitely see context becoming more important, and I think also contextual capabilities have evolved quite a lot over the last few years. But I don't think it's just context. We have like this one bucket of deterministic identifiers where a lot of what's possible today is just going to work exactly one-to-one in the future, but at like very low scale. Then we have like context on the other end of the spectrum, but I think there's quite a few things in between. I believe that deterministic identifiers aren't just useful to target users on a one-to-one basis, but they're also quite useful when advertisers and publishers start working together to actually learn from the overlap between their user bases and to then make smart targeting decisions across the 90 or 95% of users that aren't authenticated, but really make that on an informed basis, form a targeting hypothesis that's data-driven, that doesn't require any exposure of user IDs, but it still can help to make smart audience-based targeting decisions that are powered by those rich signals that every single publisher sees for their users. So I think there's pure like deterministic on one end of the spectrum, contextual on the other end, but then there's a few things in between as well.
That's interesting, and it's this middle part that enables those two worlds to almost work together and collaborate in some way that I think is where the interesting opportunities really lie, and that's exactly what you've highlighted. That's been really fascinating, David. Thank you so much for mapping that out. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much for joining us. That's been Trader Talk TV.